I've been working on the topic of augmented reality really now for years, and I have to say the passion is not subsiding. It's really quite the contrary. There are so many things happening in the area, and I'm excited to be sharing some of the previous studies and also work in progress with you. We saw a lot of overlapping interests, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards as well. So in the beginning, I'd like to actually talk on the human augmentation perspective, which is not really a concept that's been discussed in depth in marketing so far. And the reason why I think it's interesting is because it's taking a step back from the commercial context, it's bringing in the values that go beyond the consumers, that really touch to the very core of who we are as humans, how do we function, and how do we function particularly in relation to the technology. I'll talk about a couple of studies that I've done, how AR has been integrated in retail, what we've learned from that, what we can potentially now learning from these kind of investigations when we're looking at the newer technologies, the emerging technologies that are arising, such as robots now being integrated as part of retail stores, consumer journeys. And in the end, I'm hoping to discuss some ideas with you where some examples that we are seeing of late coming from brands that are combining artificial intelligence with immersive technology, so AI and AR together, and is there a prospect for that in marketing? This was a paper that was published actually in Human-Computer Interaction Journal, and it really drew my attention because it tried to conceptualize this idea of human augmentation, so how technologies are being used for enhancing human productivity, capabilities, or somehow adding to the human body and mind. So different types of methods, technologies, and their applications for enhancing either our senses, or our actions, or our cognition. And what they also point out is that we should differentiate between the human augmentation and human enhancement. I don't know if you've been discussing about that here at the Institute yet so far. So to distinguish between the technologies that are invasive to the extent that they increase the capacities in a way that it goes beyond of what humans are capable of, and would be really quite invasive in terms of surgical interventions, implants, and so on, as opposed to technologies that we are using to augment our senses, to add to them, but not changing them at the core level. So I'm wondering if the distinction between the two is something that will become important in the future. And it's interesting to see that actually human augmentation is really gaining so much interest. So their conference series really is focused on that particular concept, journals, books coming out on this topic. So it seems that it's, as a concept, it's really captivated the interest of a very wide research community. So that's how Raisamo and his colleagues sort of visualize these different types of augmentation, so augmentation of the minds, actions, different senses, and so forth. What I found really interesting is also a report that's been conducted a bit over a year ago in the US by an NGO organization, where they simply asked people about the attitudes that they have towards this kind of enhancing technologies. So different types of enhancement, again, sense, vision, joints, genetic mutations, and so on. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because what I found interesting is that they differentiate between these different types of enhancements, so enhancements that allow humans to restore a capability that was lost, so used predominantly for medicinal purposes, or prevent something to happen because there is a risk due to family history and so on. But then we also start seeing technologies that enhance our abilities beyond of what has previously been possible, either to a moderate degree or greatly enhancing beyond that. And what they found in this report is that the attitude of people towards wanting to use this kind of enhancement changes really quite substantially when we start talking about enhancement of skills beyond what humans are capable of. So to put differently, happy to use this kind of the same type of enhancement technologies when it's about restoring something that's been lost due to medical reasons, but when it's about augmenting human in a way that's not been augmented before, it seems that there is a resistance and negative attitudes arise and much lower acceptance really of such technologies, which I think is very, very important when we think about these kind of enhancements. And that's both, these kind of attitudes have been shown both for cognitive enhancement and for sense enhancements. So you see the same trend of acceptance really decreasing. And obviously, just to kind of bring together some of the key points on the macro level of the debate that has to do with human augmentation, it's one thing to, as we were talking before with Xavier, it's one thing to develop very exciting technologies that seem magic and elicit a lot of wow factor, but it's another thing to then really understand how they're going to impact the society and humans. So there are all sorts of issues arising, such as privacy, to which extent are such technologies going to be widely available? If not, is that going to widen the existing gaps in terms of different societal classes? Are these opportunities for social manipulation if appropriated by the wrong political party or system or which kind of organization? What is this doing to human autonomy and responsibility if you're able to say, well, actually, it wasn't me, it was this technology that I had implanted? How does that change the way we take responsibility? And at the very core level, and this is something I'll now elaborate on further, the idea of human identity. So in what way are we now perceiving ourselves when we start enhancing the senses in a much more intrusive way in comparison to what's been done prior in the history? And this idea of enhancement has been present before in marketing research. It has a very long tradition, but I guess the core idea I would try to point out at this stage is that what we've seen and really published at top journals, so Journal of Consumer Research, Marketing Research, and so on, is that there seems to be this ambiguity, this opposition, so to speak, between very core human tendency to enhance. So we as humans are constantly or very often wanting to show ourselves in a positive way, either to other people, either to ourselves, constantly wanting to improve, okay? So very strong motivation to enhance ourselves in any kind of way, really depending on the context and the type of person that we are. On the other hand, individuals are also very keen to protect who they are. So to protect their identity, to not change to a too radical degree, so that they are still able to relate to themselves as they are. And when technology starts to some extent changing that, things start getting very interesting. And what Riss and his colleagues found, and that was in 2008 when we were not talking about AR, VR, AI yet at all really in marketing, was that so they asked the participants if they are willing to take medication that would allow them to enhance different type of their personal or cognitive abilities, traits, and so on. And what they found was that consumers would reject these kind of enhancement if it's enhancing the traits that are core to their identity. So if it's something that they really relate to, the very strong level of who they are, then even if these kind of enhancements would allow them to have a much better memory, better cognition, better sports skills and so on, they would reject that because the threat to their identity would be too high. If the enhancement had to do with the traits that are not core to their identity, on the other hand, then the willingness to use them would be significantly higher. And I think this is really interesting, and it's a very relevant way of thinking that we can start adopting when we talk about the enhancement technologies, the way they're developing nowadays. And there are other colleagues, so Puntoni, so his research team in Rotterdam, that are applying this kind of self-enhancement concept when they're understanding to which extent consumers want to adopt machine-based processes in consumption contexts. And maybe just another study from other colleagues, so this study has been done at Columbia, that I again also found very interesting in relation to that, is what they found, and they focused on this idea of perceived humanness. So to which extent are we perceived as human, and is this something that's important when we speak about these technologies? And what they found was that when the enhancement technologies are being used, then the perception of how human you are decreases if these technologies are enhancing the abilities beyond the level that is perceived normal or human and so on. On the other hand, and that's a nice parallel with the American report that I mentioned before, if it's an enhancement that restores a lost ability, then there isn't this perceived dehumanization happening in the eyes of consumers. So I think there's something very interesting happening there, and it has an effect to how much consumers are willing to accept or reject these kind of technologies. Now, I've been particularly interested in the enhancement of the senses with regards to vision, and augmented reality has really come a very long way in marketing since the first cases that started appearing around 2010. So what we see now are very prominent and popular uses in fashion, for instance. So Zara last year had an app where you were able to scan an image in the store, and then you would see the model wearing the clothes that you were interested in. So the whole idea of augmented reality is that you see this overlay of virtual annotations situated in a real-time environment. So it's very different from VR, because virtual reality means that you are completely taken into a very different world. So that can be for gaming purposes or taking you to a different tourist destination and so on. But in AR, there is this fusion of virtual elements, pictures, content with the real-time environment, which makes for a very different consumer experience and also brings forward very different challenges. Some of the popular examples, for instance, were also the IKEA AR home app. How many of you have tried any kind of AR that you know is AR? Okay, so about half, great. And I would imagine that maybe so particularly among younger millennials and Generation Z, one type of AR has been particularly prominent, which is AR filters on Snapchat, and I'm going to talk about that later. But another AR type that's been very popular in marketing is the AR try-on, and it's hoped to be a tool that would allow to sort of bridge the imagination gap when you're thinking about the product but not really knowing how that would look like on you before going to have that product tried on you physically. So these kind of AR try-on have been developed very successfully for face apparel and sunglasses, makeup, hair, different kinds of cosmetics, also for shoe wear. Where it's been a little bit less successful is the whole body try-on. And it's not for the lack of trying, because the amount of funding that's been pumped into different types of try-on, because you can imagine the interest of the fashion industry behind this. I mean, for Amazon, that would just really be the holy grail. And it would mean such big decrease of the return costs and so forth. But because the body try-on is much more difficult, because the model needs to be 3D, it's much more difficult to project that kind of detailed level of how certain clothes would fit on a specific body. So it's going very much into that direction, but so far the examples that we've seen have not really cut through and have not really met the demand on the side of the consumer. On the other hand, one type of augmentation that's really been at the forefront now for a couple of years is augmented reality in beauty and fashion when it comes to AR filters, so seeing your face augmented in whichever way. And I would like to show you a video of a company that I collaborated with them now for 4 years, I think. So they've really specialized in AR makeup, and just to give you a taste of what they've been what kind of tech they've developed. So what the company was then really, so they've been very successful with developing the technology, but the real challenge arises when you need to understand how people are actually going to use this kind of technology. So one way for using this was via a mobile app, but obviously there was a lot of appetite for integrating this into a retail store. At the time I was finishing up my PhD and I was in London at the UCL Interaction Centre, and we agreed on conducting a user study, and it really was the first one at the time to see how people would take up to this kind of technology being part of their retail experience. And I have to say, at that stage, I really saw for the first time the value of this multidisciplinary collaboration between marketing and human-computer interaction, because marketers, quite often when we conduct experiments or studies, we remain in the labs or we use the online service, which have a high internal validity and have high value in that sense, but they offer less insights in terms of how a tech is really being used. And so what we did here is we partnered with a retail store in the Netherlands, and we integrated 2 of these iPads as part of the makeup counter, and then conducted the observation of how people are really going to be using that. And the important thing was to know that all the products that were available for them on the app were also part of the retail store. So I was there for 1 week, and I observed 120 people during that time using the app. And the things I focused on particularly was how they approached the app, how they interacted with it, so which kind of feature they used, what were their comments, their responses, and their subsequent behavior. And in parallel to that, we also conducted a survey to get more of the quantitative data from the study. And what was interesting here was that in the beginning, actually, when people stepped into the store, most of them didn't really notice the app, even though we tried very hard with making the interface visually appealing and so on. And what was actually the important driver of triggering the interaction was the role of the shop assistant. So there had to be that human contact, someone pointing out, oh, we have this technology, would you like to try, and explaining a little bit about it, because it was very novel at the time. So people wouldn't have really expected something like that to appear in the store. And important differences also arose just in terms of the very basic demographics. So the way how women and men used it was very, very different. So for women shoppers, it very quickly became quite a utilitarian tool, so something to allow them to browse through a lot of different products, whilst for men, not really intending to shop for makeup that they would buy and use later on, they actually had a lot of fun. Most of them claimed that it was the first time they were able to try on makeup. That's fine, even if they wear it beforehand. They really enjoyed trying out something that otherwise they wouldn't be doing, and they were going for much more dramatic looks. So for them, the experience was very different, just because of the type of consumers that they are. And what we saw was that the virtual mirror was perceived very realistic. So the way people interacted was that they made these kind of facial expressions that they would otherwise have made if trying on the real makeup, so pouting the lips and raising the eyebrows and so on, so very realistic. And there was a lot of interest from them in understanding to which extent this virtual augmentation is accurate as opposed to the real products that they would try on. So to understand this match between digital and physical. And some of them also then bought the products directly immediately after the interaction, but for most of them what we saw was that it helped them focus on a specific color, on a specific product that they afterwards still tried on to see that physical, to have that physical experience, and then they were convinced enough to continue with the purchase. So different roles in the consumer journey really, depending on the shoppers. But particularly what was the driver, what drove consumers to there was this high level of playfulness. Also for children, so that changed the shopping experience for women and so forth. And also the survey results showed us that they really perceived the AR mirror to be augmenting their face, so they really thought that their face was augmented. It was perceived as very playful, but at the same time also quite convenient, and it drove their behavioral intentions. So this is just simple descriptive statistics. The important part here really is that the learnings from this observational study were very important then for the company when developing further virtual mirrors for other brands, because now it started to be much more important to understand, okay, how do you situate this into a retail store so that it's triggering interaction, that it's triggering the type of interactions you think are important for consumers, and how do you understand this diversity of profiles that people would have when interacting with this kind of technology. And one example I wanted to show you was so you will now see how different this really got. So the same company, Holishan, then developed the virtual mirror for a very famous brand. I don't know if you have it here in France, Charlotte Tilbury, so it's very high-end luxury and so on. And you will see that here the experience with the mirror is now very different. It's much more integrated as part of the store, as part of the brand. And the studies really contributed to this kind of.
You had a plenty money, 1922. You let other women make a fool of you. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out here and get me some money too. You're sitting down wondering what it's all about. You ain't got no money, they will put you out. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. If you had prepared 20 years ago, you wouldn't be wandering out from door to door. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money.
So what would you say was the biggest difference between the makeup that you saw before and this kind of experience here? What? Just in the way maybe of how they were browsing through it in the app.
They did some new classification.
What kind of classification?
I don't know, like this kind of configuration or cluster, define different types.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly, and this is actually very related to the core of the brand, because in the previous example that I showed you, they were just browsing through products really, but here they were buying into stores, into full looks. So I think there was a Bombshell and Rock Shake and so on, and these are all makeup looks that the brand has been creating in very strong collaboration with models, VIPs, and so on, fashion experts, and so they were really trying to tell the story through this kind of augmentation. It wasn't anymore just trying on the products. So all of a sudden, this mirror was not anymore about the technology. It was about that experience that you have in the store through the story that they're trying to tell, and took a very, very different approach. And it's been extremely successful, got a lot of awards. The brand adopted it in its many stores in London and Middle East, I think also in Hong Kong and so on, because it was a concept that consumers could really relate to. Now, another thing that is, so at that point we understood, okay, people are really is there a noise coming from here? Yeah, we're going to. Sorry. So now we understood that this kind of technology is something that people do really enjoy, it's working really well and so on. And, you know, we saw lots of positive approaches, but obviously things are never that straightforward. So we now needed to understand more, what are these drivers behind the positive reactions that people have towards this kind of augmentation? And we started thinking about how that makes people feel about themselves. So we started focusing away from the technology and understanding more on how people feel about themselves when they're using that, and if that relates to the products, if there is a direct link between this, between the self, the augmentation, and the products. And we had a lot of fun with my colleague Marta Pizzetti. She's based in Toulouse. So we ran 2 experimental studies where we were trying to understand if this kind of augmentation actually can have a direct effect on how you feel about yourself, so on your self-esteem. And is that something that's then leading the purchase intentions? Because if something makes you feel good about yourself, then it's possibly going to be a driver for subsequent behavior, right? It's like with people. If people make you feel good about who you are, if you enjoy yourself in the company of those people, then you're going to seek out more of that company. That's how humans work. And what we tried here is to see, basically the way how we tested this was to see if the partial augmentation, so just the lips, is something that has lower effect on self-esteem as opposed to this kind of full augmentation as a experimental manipulation to understand the effect. And what we indeed found was that when you have this kind of full augmentation, the effect on self-esteem was significantly higher. So you felt better. The consumers reported to feel better about themselves with this kind of overlay, and also significantly higher psychological ownership of these products that they were trying on. And we saw that that actually led indirectly to purchase intention. So we haven't found a direct link between trying on a full augmentation as opposed to only lipstick. But when we considered these other factors, we saw that there was a positive indirect effect on purchase intention. And now we realized, okay, this full augmentation is something that people really respond to. But, you know, speaking about makeup, we assumed that the role of personal expertise is really quite important. So you need to know how to operate not just the technology, but to also how much of a knowledge do you have about a specific category. And here we found, so here we then had 2 groups where participants in both groups had this kind of full augmentation, but in one group they were able to really customize it, to personalize it, so to choose all the products themselves, whilst in the other group they had 10 pre-designed looks that they could swipe through, but they weren't able to really change the different products and so forth. And what we found here was that the role of expertise actually became really important. So the self-esteem indeed increased when they were able to use this kind of augmentation, when it was personalized, but only for those, but significantly more for those that had this kind of expertise in that product category. And again, here we found that for those experts, when they were able to see themselves augmented, that affected their self-esteem, that created that psychological ownership with the products, and that indirectly led to higher purchase intention. All sounds great, very nice story, but again, we understood that, well, actually things are not so simple. And even though we found this increase in self-esteem and self-expressiveness, we thought, well, probably we haven't considered personal traits that might affect this kind of process. But also, perhaps even more importantly, what made us think about that at the time was that the technologies then developed much further. So the Snapchat filters became really ubiquitous. You could see them being used very frequently, and people using the photos on their social media with the filters. And obviously, these kind of filters are not, at least at first instance, meant for product try-on, but they have created a lot of playful engagement, a lot of hedonic engagement, and it seemed that people just enjoyed seeing themselves with the doggy ears and the tongue coming out of their mouth when they opened it and so on, which in a way is kind of weird because there's so much investment being done into AR field, but then in the end it seems that the tag that's most popular is you being able to see yourself as a dog in the mirror. But that's humans for you, it seems. And I guess the thing that I love most about technology is that you really can't seem to be able to predict how people are going to use the technology, which kind of features they're really going to buy into. And there's been actually a negative side effect to this, to the popularity of these Snapchat filters, which is called the Snapchat dysmorphia. I don't know how much there's been talk about that in the French media, but in British media, this has been discussed really to quite a great extent. And basically what's happening is these filters beautify people to a degree that's changing the beauty ideals that they have about themselves, so kind of trying to make their face appear really beautified. And that's something that, even though there is a element of uncanny valley effect to it, is something that people seem to really enjoy to see that, but actually that's then drove certain vulnerable consumers, and there I'm talking about younger women, people with lower self-esteem and so on, to seek plastic surgeries that would then really modify their face to look like their image as modified by these filters. So all of a sudden the hedonic engagement and the playfulness with the doggy ears is leading to very severe concrete consequences. And here now what we did, and this is our work in progress really, the last study I'll talk about, is now we wanted to understand, okay, what is really happening with the sense of self when you're seeing yourself augmented in the mirror. Because there is a difference between trying on makeup and seeing yourself augmented, because when you're able to use the AR mirror, first of all, you can swipe through so many different products. What you see is intangible, so it appears and disappears very quickly, but the effect is very realistic. So despite the fact that it's virtual, it's something that is very believable. And we coined this term, augmented self, and we believe that this is a notion that can start explaining in how we, as consumers and as people, are thinking about ourselves when we are faced with a certain type of augmentation of who we are. Now, I've been focusing on this predominantly in the area of face augmentation, but I believe there is much potential for understanding augmented self also in other areas. And we've conducted 3 experimental studies. We've been working on this now really for 2 years. And what we wanted to understand is what is the difference between seeing yourself in a regular mirror and seeing yourself in an AR mirror. And what we know from previous studies, and these studies really decades old, is that when a person sees themselves in a mirror, what that does is it focuses you on yourself. So it increases your self-awareness. And when the self-awareness is increased, what happens is that you are very aware of your actual self, of who you are, but also it makes it's more salient how short you might fall of the ideals that you have about yourself, okay? So you become aware of, okay, this is who I am, but this is also how far I, as me, am from the ideal me that I would like to be. So this ideal actual gap is a really, really important concept in consumer behavior because it's driving so much of purchase, compensatory behavior, and so on. Because when you're aware of this gap, what happens is that then you usually try to close it, to do something to repair this sort of threat that you're experiencing. And what we wanted to understand here is, okay, is there a difference between people who have a high self-esteem, think positively about themselves, as opposed to those that actually have quite a low self-esteem? Would they respond differently to an AR mirror as opposed to a regular mirror? And so first we conducted a study with two conditions. In one we had a regular mirror, in the other one we had an AR mirror. We also had the no mirror condition, but it isn't so relevant for the story. And that is the kind of makeup that participants in the AR mirror saw on themselves. And to really focus only on the most important results, what we found, and I think you should be able to see this, to read this from the graphs, is that this ideal actual gap that happens, which means how much of a distance there is between your actual self and the ideal self that you would like to be. So as expected, in a regular mirror, for low self-esteem people, the gap is high, right? If you don't have a great opinion about yourself and you see yourself in the mirror, which is focusing you on yourself, you become more aware of, oof, actually, yeah, because I have a low self-esteem, I don't have a great opinion of myself, and the ideals are very far away, so this gap is very high for low self-esteem people, as opposed to high self-esteem people who, think, well, I'm just brilliant, so that's a pleasure to see myself in the mirror, and the gap there is really quite low. Now, the interesting thing here really was to see that in the AR mirror, the ideal actual gap is significantly different. And here we found significant differences across the two studies, both for high self-esteem people and for low self-esteem people. So for low self-esteem people, in the AR mirror, the gap diminished as opposed to when they saw themselves in the normal one. But for the high self-esteem people, surprisingly, this gap actually increased. So and the way how we interpreted these results is that actually, when they saw, if you like yourself who you are, and you see yourself changed, and this virtual change is really quite believable, is realistic, that is actually something that's then making you aware of the fact that, you could change, so you're not as brilliant as you think you are, or as attractive, because we only focused on appearance. There is potential for negative types of who you are. So high self-esteem people do not like this kind of change. They're very kind of rejecting towards something that's changing them, mailing them in that kind of a sense, and reacting to it really very differently. And we saw these results replicated in study 1 and study 2, and in study 3 we changed the task a bit, so there they were browsing more through the products, because we wanted to see that if we give them the control, would that actually make the difference for high self-esteem people? But the results were actually the same. So low self-esteem people positively affected by these potential changes that are depicted by the augmentation, but on the high self-esteem people scale, there would be a rejection of that kind of a scale. And why is that relevant for marketing? Well, we saw that there is an effect on the variety-seeking behavior. So now all of a sudden, low self-esteem people, when they saw themselves augmented, were willing to consider a much wider variety of products, because they suddenly saw that's again our interpretation, they saw all these different positive versions of who they could be, and so they started being more interested and are more malleable to this positive enhancement to self-change. Whilst for high self-esteem people, they became even more resilient to a variety, which we took as a measure of how much they are wanting to experiment with themselves and expand the self-concept, really. So we try to be as rigorous as possible with these studies, and we believe that we're really tapping into something that might be very, very relevant to consider. So all of a sudden now we're starting to understand that no, it's not just these positive reactions that people have when they see themselves augmented, beautified, with virtual overlays of products and so on. It actually matters really substantially how that makes them feel about themselves, because depending on these differences, they will then react very differently later on in consumer journeys when it comes to buying the products, choosing different types of products, and so on. And what's interesting to see is that, these AR filters are not confined only to makeup. We see these kind of self-expressive filters which are being adopted now. So it's funny because it was in the Louis Vuitton fashion show where these kind of filters that usually we mainly see in virtual forms are now appearing on catwalks with models actually wearing this kind of face wear, which is not makeup, it's not jewelry, but something that we've predominantly seen on online before. So there is this translation from digital to physical. Again, a lot happening in the fashion sector. And you'll have to excuse me that I'm sticking so much to the makeup products. I think it's just an example for what is happening in other industries as well. And I think learnings go, I would hope, way beyond the beyond this area. At the end of the day, the researchers, we work with what we have, and when you have a good relationship with the company and they're interested in this kind of research, it's a great opportunity. And what we've seen now happening, and this is from December 2019, is L'Oreal started integrating AI into the try-on that they're offering on Amazon. So again, reiterating the interest that Amazon has on pushing for try-on on their online platform, on their online store. And the AI part here is linked to the neural network. So the identification of the facial features and then applying of the makeup is much more precise because of AI, because it's personalizing it much more to the skin type, the skin color, and so on, also to the lighting background, and so on. So that's one example where I've seen the two coming together. And another example, this was also created by the company Volition. So they did this for Max Factor, and they launched this about a year ago, and it's still a beta version, but I think the learnings are beautiful, because what they did here is that they completely changed the way the website visit happens for consumers. Because usually when you go to a brand's website, okay, there is all the branded content, the stories and so on, but very quickly they would focus you on products, so endless browsing through products. Now here they've totally changed the consumer journey around. So when you land on the website, it's focusing on you and saying, okay, let's get started with analyzing your facial features, different types of the type of skin you might have, and let's take that as a basis for the products that you might be interested in. So you then go ahead with the live analysis, so you get this kind of scanning of your face, and then what appears is the description of your facial features, and after that it's asking for some input from consumers, saying, okay, so which category of products are you interested in, what kind of look are you after, and then on the basis of that is taking you to the product recommendation page, and it's showing you both the products and those products depicted on you. Okay, so that's a very different type of consumer journey. Now, what I'm interested in here, and this is what I'm thinking about now with my other research colleagues is to start understanding how these recommendations that are being fed to consumers by AI, and in this case that's combined with the augmentation, how consumers react to that. So first of all, from the previous studies that I've talked about, we've learned how sensitive people are to this kind of augmentation, right? So it's something to be taken very precisely, seriously, with a lot of attention. And it seems that there is, to some extent, some resilience to high level of a change. Because of what we talked about in the beginning, people wanting to be quite true to themselves, but at the same time wanting to enhance themselves. Now, what happens when these kind of recommendations are being fed to you by a machine, by an AI? And I'm not sure, so far, I don't understand, I don't know if there have been studies done in marketing, not to my knowledge, to know how consumers react to that when the system is proposing you. So, you know, you have the visually changed self, and this change has been done by a computer. So it's almost like there are two threats or two levels of opportunities for enhancement, and the combination of the two, I don't think it's well understood at all. And at which part of the journey would that kind of service be preferred or required? So what I'm interested here in understanding is what is going to drive the acceptance or rejection of these kind of AI-based recommendations when we talk about online platforms that are visualizing the products that are very personal, intimate to you in that kind of way. So I would imagine that obviously personal factors such as self-esteem and so on are affecting this process. And what we started talking about before with Xavier is, I think it's important to start thinking about what consumers are looking for in terms of these recommendations. So what should be the basis of these kind of recommendations? To which extent do brands need to start explaining, interpreting these recommendations? So, for instance, those, because I've been through that Max Factor journey numerous times, and I would like to know, are these products products that are recommended to everyone who has blue eyes and brown hair? In that case, well, I don't feel special anymore, and as we all know, the need for uniqueness among many consumers nowadays is very, very high. So I would imagine that could be a strong basis for rejection. But if it's explaining to me that that kind of recommendation is done in some other ways, so that it's personalizing it to a very different degree, in a very different way, then it might be something that I would be more open, more accepting towards. So what kind of personalization are consumers looking for in those moments? Does it need to be very accurate? Does it need to be very unique? Does it need to be very serendipitous? So surprise me, show me something that I would never look for, that I would never find myself. And what we know, so I've now started looking into the area of recommender systems, and so it's very kind of technological field, but I've seen from, before how fruitful these kind of collaborations can be. And what I know from recommender systems when it comes to information search, for instance, on search engine, there the relevance of results is hugely important. So when you get results on Google, it needs to be relevant to you, otherwise you're not going to be happy with that kind of information delivery. But this relevance can be very, very different depending on the context. So if you find results about, Olympic Games in 2012, right now, that's something that I'm no longer interested in, but 8 years ago, if I was looking for the results at the time of what was happening at the Olympic Games, it would be hugely relevant. So relevance, very contextual, and also very different depending on different types of people. So how are we going to define relevance when it comes to this kind of artificially based recommendations? And how are we going to translate that into consumers? And are we going to be presenting that as an enhancement that's being done externally? What is the role of the input coming from the consumer side? And is it all going to get a little bit too much with the visual augmentation and this type of cognitive enhancement, I don't think there is a lot of understanding there. So that's why I think the future is really exciting. Thank you so much, and I would be really happy to discuss this further and any questions you might have to try to answer them. Thank you.
We share the same mic. First thing, I'd like to thank you for spending 1 hour talking about one of my favorite topics.
Makeup?
That's not makeup. That's about the question of what does our interactions with machine teaches us about being humans, right? And that's really the core of what you have talked about us, and that's what motivates me. That's really the question I'm asking all day long since more than 20 years now. It's what does this interaction with machine learns about us humans, as a user, but also as a designer of this technology. Why do we build this? So let me go straight to the point. The answer is it helps us learn what makes us humans. We build this technology, and through these questions, we learn about ourselves, right? And you talked during 1 hour about your discoveries, and I'd like to thank you so much. This was, I mean, makeup is one of my cool topics, but that was not my passion, right?
So neither is mine. It's, it's just fun to work with it.
So one thing I would like just to introduce myself a little bit, very quickly. So I'm engineer, developer, so I write code. And I write code to create these kind of things. So interactive technology that really interact with people in a different way, new way. So I'm also an entrepreneur, and I'm a dad. So as an entrepreneur, I built a company 5 years ago, and we have been creating applications for robots. How many of you have ever seen a paper robot? Paper robot? A white robot? Okay, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So not that many, right? There's a reason why, and we will talk about that. And we learned a lot during this journey, and finally we realized that we could put all these learnings into more affordable stuff, like this one. Basically, you could name it a tablet, but when we put some interactive technology, it becomes an interactive agent, kind of a robot, right? So this is what we do, and we are a software company building software and delivering our services for many companies. So in the journey, there is something really interesting. I would like to come back on one of your experimentations. Really funny thing, on the makeup mirror, you told us that 90% of the people didn't realize that there was a new experience, right? What I find crazy is that when we put a paper robot, a now robot, or this kind of thing, 90% of the people expect something from this machine. But at the end of the day, they don't have what they expected. So it's really about like completely the opposite that is happening. And I'd like to discuss about that with you regarding the perception as a user, the perception that we have regarding the interaction with this machine. So the makeup system was like crazy because it made a lot of sense for the user, because at the end of the day, they learned about what's the best product, and as you told us, what's the best story, which is even better than just choosing a product. And with this kind of technology, it's exactly the opposite. The human in front of this kind of technology is engaging with it and expecting so high because of the shape, because of the way it moves. But that's a great opportunity, right? What if we could mix the two?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I guess what you mentioned in the beginning. So is this? Should we take a seat? Yeah. As you said, we're learning not just as designers and researchers and entrepreneurs, but also consumers and users are learning about this technology. So I'm wondering to which extent, because what happened, in our discoveries is that in the beginning, when there is a low knowledge and also by consequence low involvement with these kind of technologies, because there just isn't a lot of awareness, the experience is very different as opposed to later on when there is more awareness about that. And now a lot of people are talking about robots, about different kind of interactive screens and so on. And because of, I think to some extent, exaggerated hype around what artificial intelligence can do, the expectations might be high to the extent that can be difficult to meet. So how do you now, when you're at this stage where there is this gap that you mentioned, how do you address this gap? How do you adjust so either you do it in terms of, from the consumer perspective, adjusting their expectations, and how do you do that? Do you do that through, tutorials that are there prior to this kind of interaction, some kind of demonstration of what they can expect from that? Or do you try to signal somehow what the tasks are, so to really to be precise in advance of what is it that you can expect from that? I don't know, like parallels with the Alexa come to my mind. Yeah. So obviously, or Echo, I had way higher expectations from what Alexa can do for me, and now it's my cooking timer and choosing music and weather, and we're just about finished. So it's and I would imagine that maybe if there was a clear precision beforehand of what is it that this robot can do for me, maybe the disappointment would have been lower, or just the nature of the interaction would have been different. I would be really interested to hear what have you learned, for instance, from having these kind of robots in stores and in public places. How did people interact with it? What are they looking for when they engage?
One of the things we've learned is there are three main components in the interaction with an embodied system, right? If we're talking about a robot or an interactive device, it's an embodied device, right? So what we've learned is that there are three pillars. The first one is the engagement, and this is exactly what we are talking about. Engagement is about, a loop between what the user expects from the device and what he really gets from it. And as a human, we do that all the time between humans when we interact with each other, and it comes a lot from the eyes and from the behavior, right? So if you put it in front of what technology is offering to us today, previously we had applications with buttons. Does it seem really natural for a human? Not really. Then we had voice. You talk about Alexa. Okay, so we start to come into the cognitive world, which is acceptable and natural and instinctive for humans. So this engagement loop, you have to close it with really natural and engaging stuff that humans understand without having to learn it, right? So this is what we learned. And to be pragmatic, when you put a robot that really looks like a human, people expect it to behave as a human. So 100% of the time, there is deception at the end of the day, because that's not the case, right? That's not the case yet, and there might be a lot of work before it even happens. The second thing we learned, and we can come back to that because you talked a lot about it, is the emotion. Emotion is another way to connect with the user, is another way to communicate and to enhance the communication. Between humans, we say, and I'd be happy to have a really serious study about that, we usually say that less than 20% of the message is carried by the words. Less than 20%. What about the rest? How do we convey the full message? Emotion is a big part of it. And I think we've seen it, especially when with the Tilbury experiments, where definitely we are talking about a story. It's about empathic design, and it conveys a lot of messages. And we had quite a similar experience with robots in retail stores, with robots also in retirement houses. retirement houses where our robots were used by elderly people that didn't have the cognitive ability to use a tablet or to use a laptop. And they finally succeeded in getting access to digital information through this kind of technology. And I really think that emotion through the shape and through the experience, the overall experience, is a key to convey a message. So I'd be also really happy to hear about how this particular aspect is part of the, the self-esteem, the self-esteem evaluation. Is there a link with the emotion that is conveyed by the experience? And if we could talk about that at some point, maybe we can imagine that the emotion that the device wants to convey has to be adapted to the consumer in front of it. And it's part of a way to close the loop in the engagement, right? What do you think about bringing emotions, evaluation of the emotion in real time, and adapting the experience depending on that?
Yeah, so we so I would first briefly mention an example. So we tried to do something like that. So I mean, there is a lot of work in technology development now in recognition of facial expressions, right? Where the machines are trying to, the cameras and the sensors are trying to read the emotions and then try to adapt the responses on the basis of that. You might know more about that than I do. What the algorithms that I've seen working had limitations. And again, I think either you have this kind of technology developed very well to the extent that maybe there is a small margin for a mistake, but overall it's working quite well. And I think that links to the recommender systems, for instance. So when you're recommending something, actually, it's not that easy to give a good recommendation. And if people expect something to be quite good, then you can very quickly go wrong. But if they expect something that is sort of accurate, then it means that you will almost never get it totally right, but you will get something that's close enough, and satisfaction will be sort of okay, will be sufficient. So you can either, I think, think about bringing in emotions in terms of tracking them and then trying to respond to that. I think there are technological limitations when it comes to that. But when you think about the responses from consumers and how that's driving the experience with technology, I mean, that is one of the strongest drivers, right? You can, even if something is I mean, excuse this example, but a partner can look very good on paper, right? It's like, okay, ticks all the boxes, but it doesn't tick. Yeah, and something else would not maybe tick all the boxes on the paper, but you feel amazing with that person. But then I wonder, are these same principles going to be applying to interactions with robots? Because are we looking for that connection? Are we looking there for that enjoyment? And in my understanding, for some of the recent research that's come out in marketing, is that it depends quite a lot on the tasks. So when the tasks relate to, I don't know, high involvement, low involvement products, low involvement services, or something that you're not that bothered about and you just want it to be done, so sort of automation, I think there the precision, the utilitarian value would be much more important. You don't want to emotionally connect with everything, right? On the other hand, if there are things that are really dear to you and close to your heart and so on, there getting this fit between the emotive response or the emotive connection, I think, is much more important. So again, quite complex. Just some thinking,
You're absolutely right on the fact that we realized in real world with our concrete applications that not every use cases need to have an emotional connection to the user. There are some stuff that needs just to be practical, efficient, and so on. That's it. And it leads me to another point I'd like to discuss with you, is about as a company and a private company, we always have in mind the return on investment, right? So in return on investment, there is investment. So all of that has a cost. And basically what we learned on our journey is that you can put really exciting stuff to your customer and spend a lot of money to try, and you can learn that it makes a lot of sense. And that's okay. So that's perfect for our topic, because we are learning what makes us human through this journey. As a company, when you try to have a significant impact on your own business, it has to scale. So what we learned also, and I would like to share with you, is that the kind of technology we are talking about is sometimes a little bit too more expensive to be really acceptable, right? The users might want them to be here all the time, be kind of a mainstream experience that they can, have all the time. But it also has to be connected to the cost and to what, yeah. So we learned on our journey that some really expensive and really cool stuff were not the only way to make the customer live the same experience. And that's exactly what led us to start with robots, humanoid robots. Not much of you have seen one. And one of the reasons why is that because it's really expensive, and the return on investment is not that easy to evaluate and then to scale. So that's what led us to start with these robots and now go to this kind of machine, which is basically in all of our pocket. It's digital screen. You can touch it and you can interact with it through a camera, through a touch, and you can talk to it. And basically, when we summarize what we learned by interacting with robots, we can do the same with engaging technologies that is embodied into avatars. And that comes to mainstream, that leads us to mainstream solutions. And I think there is kind of the same trajectory for the AR techniques, all the, all these solutions that are really efficient, that you can learn a lot from one-shot experience, just to start. And the same trajectory leads to more mainstream solutions. And I'd like to hear about your feedbacks about the way you see a link between the in-store experience with, I think, a very expensive setup, and the relation with the Snapchat, which is in everyone's hand for free. So it's kind of the same trajectory. It starts with something big we have to learn, and then it goes mainstream with a more practical solution. So that leads me to the question I'd like to talk about, because we just discussed about that before coming in, is about intrusion. It's about intrusion. How do we want this technology to come into our life? Because that's okay as a consumer to start to try and learn in a shop with something great, may it be a robot or an AR mirror. But what does it make sense for me to get it in my pocket and to share my life with this kind of technology? How do you see this, acceptability and acceptance of all this really cool stuff we are working on?
I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, right? It's so important, yeah. So how do you go from, there was the CES a couple of weeks ago,
yep.
And how much of that technology are we really going to see? Maybe 1%, not even. And so much investment behind it. And I think to some extent it depends a little bit on the business model. So one study, and I haven't talked about that, but recently we've been interviewing executive profiles from luxury companies to understand their perception and how they see the strategic role of immersive technologies for their luxury brands. And what we've seen is that the way they think about it is not that it would all of a sudden lead to a completely new, completely different world where everyone is going to walk around with smart lenses and everything is going to be augmented and so on. That's not how at this stage, I think both academics and practitioners we're not seeing it going in that direction. But it is exciting technology that offers more than what a laptop screen or a desktop or a smartphone could give. So if these technologies, the way I always think about technologies is that if they offer something more, if another device offers something more than what the tablet and my smartphone allows me to do, and if that more is of relevance for me, then yes, there is the potential to go ahead and for people to really want to use that. Now, what you talked about is, okay, how do you scale, right? And I guess it depends again on the business model. So without wanting to say too much, but the Coalition Agency, for instance, so they work with these kind of bespoke solutions, which works very well for them. It's a specific niche they've specialized in and so on. But big platforms such as Snapchat have a very different approach, where it's about, okay, how can we push these features to as many of our users as possible, and how are we going to turn that into a business model? And that is one way, and a lot of companies are thinking in that direction, that it is all about making these new technologies, these new features part of the popular platforms, because that's where most people are. So if it's something that makes sense as part of those platforms, and that's also to some extent how TikTok came out, right? Because there you can do all sorts of crazy stuff with interactive content. There is AR component there, and it's something that really allows younger people to express themselves in a certain way. So it links to their self-expressiveness, and it's a huge driver, so a lot of scalability happening there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all companies and all business models need to go down that path, because if you specialize in a specific disease or specific condition or a specific sector, maybe scalability is not the answer, but the value that people perceive in having that specific technology in that context is so high that they would be willing to pay that kind of a premium. So I know it's a bad answer to say it depends. I mean, that's the answer you want to avoid usually. Yeah. But if you want to maybe say a couple of more words about the type of robots that you've developed, in which kind of context you've used them, and how you think that affected your thinking about how you want to develop them further. Yeah. And do you think about that in going, very, in terms of very high scalability, or do you think that specialization is something that could hold the key to business success?
Really, definitely something really cool that probably everyone has seen in sci-fi. And we all have different expectations about what we really want robots to do, right? The word robots means work. That's the root of the word. Robot means work. But that's not really cool, right? So along the journey, we realized that the specific robots we were working on were focused on interaction, right? Interacting with people. And the only thing we were looking for was to get some form factor that enabled a really easy engagement with the customer. Because our main intuition was that using natural and instinctive interactive devices leads us as a consumer to use technology really easily. My grandma, 96, she didn't ever understand what internet is, right? She learned how to use television. She didn't understand a single thing about a PC, a computer. We tried a smartphone. It was quite okay, but her cognitive, abilities went down, and at the end she couldn't even use it. So this is where we are at Humano. This is where we are, because when I tried to put a small robot, humanoid form factor, in front of my grandma, she just was looking at it, listening to what he had to say, and she was connected to the digital world. This piece of plastic, motors and electronic cards has connected her to the digital world for the first time. And she didn't even realize that she was connected to the digital world. She heard some news from the internet, but she didn't know she was using internet. So that's what we learned. We learned that with a really specific and well-designed shape and form factor, we can trigger the engagement with the user. I'm just coming back, to your study where 90% of the people didn't even understand that there was a crazy experience just in front of them. But for my grandmother, it was just the opposite. She wanted to have this crazy experience, but the crazy experience was not so good enough for her to adopt this. So this is exactly the journey we had. So from that observation, the company shifted to this kind of technology. So basically, we asked ourselves, okay, what can we do to bring this instinctive engagement to any kind of device? Do I really need a humanoid robot to engage people? Do I really need this form factor to get the attention, to catch the attention of the user, to engage a loop, and at the end, to deliver some messages? Robots can do the job. Good news is that this kind of device, interactive device, can do the job also. And it's just about software. We are putting a face, so the eye contact is one of the keys for the engagement loop. As soon as you see two eyes, the human brain is made of, I need to check what's happening there. It's an evolutionary process. We have it. So it can be a cat, a dog, a man, or a thing. It has two eyes, it's catching my attention. Then you just connect for the very first milliseconds. What does the device has to do just right after that? The same as we do humans. We have to respond. I see you, you see me, and we engage. How do we engage? We are not even talking with each other. I'm just talking to you, but I know we are engaged together because you are giving me a lot of feedback from your behavior. And we just have to do the same with this kind of technology. So that's what I mentioned when I talk about, less than 20% of the message is carried by the words and the voice. A lot more is carried by the behavior. And we can do the same with this kind of interactive technology. I think we are at a tipping point where technology is based on some operating systems, right? Technology operating systems that comes from the old world. It comes from the world of the page, right? Even this great technology has the same shape as the page I'm writing down since I'm a kid. And it didn't really change. Even on your laptop, you all have squares and some spaces where you can write down some things. And you can interact with it, but that's just an imagination of what the human could do. That's not the way humans really behave naturally. And as soon as you remove this, we are at this tipping point. As soon as you remove this old operating system world, and you think out of the box. What if you had an operating system that doesn't rely on a window, on buttons, even on sliders, all these things that we use with our fingers? Just imagine that you remove this. What are the inputs for this technology? The same as us. We can see the word, we can hear the word, and we can feel the word. The last part is what makes us human, right? But the first two, today AI enables perception capabilities that makes the system able to understand what's happening in front of it. And this is the, I don't know if I'm answering your question because I went a lot from here. But that's what we learned, right? We learned that the operating system and the foundations of the technology today is based on the old world, the ancient world. We are on a revolution where cognitive systems can rely on new inputs that are really more connected to what we use all the time as humans. And that's really the case for the perception of what's happening around us. And that's also the case, and it links to what you said previously regarding the recommendation systems. It's also the case for the decision process. All right? For a computer, decision is really, structured, and if then else, if this then that, it's really the basis. Now we have some other ways to take decisions. Neural nets doesn't decide on an if then else way. That's exactly your questions about explainability. How do we know this algorithm is recommending some product? Where does it come from? It comes from a system that doesn't rely on explainable rules.
Well, that's the challenge, really, right? Because are you wanting to accept? Thank you. Are you wanting to accept something that is being done in a way that you can't understand it? Mm-hmm. Because we would still, I think, we still have. I mean, yeah, it's true. We don't go and, especially if it's low involvement product. I mean, it's not that you read now into details everything about that product, how it was produced, manufactured, and so on. But if we're talking about personalized recommendations with regards to things that are important to us, I think you do need to understand. I don't know. I really don't know, and it's something that I would very much now like to do. So understanding how these kind of systems that combine AI and AR. How consumers are responding to that, and are there things that can be part of it that are going to sway the responses in one way or another? But on one hand, to me, that's part of the decision process. But what you talked about, just now, saying, okay, imagine that we put away all the hardware, and then we have a much more intuitive, seamless, gaze-based, touch-based, voice-based, and so on, system in front of us that reacts in the exact same way as the human does. And I guess my question is, talking from human augmentation perspective, to which extent do we want these kind of systems to behave and be like humans? Because I would like to believe that human race is pretty special. We've done some awful things, but overall, I think humans are wonderful. And do we want to give these unique features that we've been developing and have as a race, do we want to offset them? To which degree are we happy with them being replicated through these kind of enhancement systems? Because the thing is, the more intuitive and seamless something is, the more it's disappearing as a technology. On one hand, it's kind of becoming part of you, so you're adopting that as part of your identity. I mean, we relate very strongly to our smartphones and so on. We would personalize them. We personalize our different types of interfaces and so on. But on the other hand, are there? So that's obviously one way for technologies to just become part of you, and then you don't make this distinction anymore. But on the other hand, are there things that we don't want to see replicated? Yeah. And I really don't know. I would really like to know more about, but what I've seen so far is that there is quite a lot of discussions around this on an abstract level, but these kind of concrete examples that allow us to learn are scarce at this stage and coming out more, I would say. So yeah, but one thing I did want to just kind of prod again is, the way how you've been deploying the robots, in which context, so not about the type of interface, but in which context did it work best, do you think? For what task, for what, in what space, what did it do that it drove that engagement? So in addition to that emotive component.
Sorry, I feel really guilty to interrupt this amazing conversation. Because I have actually a question that is very much related to what you're saying. Please. And also it's related, I think, to the last question that you had in your slides. So, regarding the explainability of AI technologies or recommendation systems, for instance, which I find very interesting because I recently tried to study how cultural assumptions might enter the system to some extent, following a line in social research, sociology, that tries to investigate a bit what are the social implications of these systems. And actually, there is an article which is not precisely connected to recommendation systems and augmented reality, but it's an article of the Journal of Consumer Research of 2016 by Summers, Smith, and Redstack, which actually is called, talks about the fact that when you have behavioral targeting, so the micro-targeted ads on social media, sometimes even if these ads don't target a specific social category, consumers perceive that there are some implicit social labels in the ads. And this perception of an implicit social label, for instance linked to race or social class, then impact the decision of buying the product or not, for instance. And I feel like this, to some extent, has also something to do with what you have shown in your amazing research, and especially the question that to which you ended up your presentation, because when you have the different proposals of these different looks, if we imagine that, for instance, the recommendation system function following, I don't know, a collaborative filtering systems that suggests similar looks to similar people, let's say, like, I don't know, Amazon, let's imagine a simplified version, or for sure it will be more sophisticated than that. I assume that if many people with similar social characteristics tend to follow similar, to like similar products, then an implied social label might emerge, and so you might have some unpleasant situations where you are accused, for instance, of some sorts of discrimination because you have maybe people of from different backgrounds being suggested similar products. So I wanted to know your opinion about this possibility, and eventually also from your perspective, how you can try to copy with these sort of issues.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I guess, then you start talking about, and it's not an area, I don't have an expertise in this area, but how biases are incorporated into AI systems, right? I mean, there is now quite a lot of discourse about certain systems being gender biased, race biased, and so on. And I guess, I think, yeah, you raise a really important point. So, to know to which extent these kind of implications related to class, race, and so on are going to start being incorporated in these kind of recommendations. And so I think that's one part that I would imagine consumers, because they/we are becoming more and more aware of, how we shop, the consumer savviness, so to speak, is increasing. So I would expect that we would want to know more about these kind of biases maybe being integrated in the systems. And yeah, I would really like to know, would it make consumers behave differently if they know that these kind of preconceptions are integrated, incorporated, or not? And is that in any way different from previous traditional ads that you've mentioned? Is there something about the way how machines recommend products to us that make our perceptions of that different as opposed to how we read that on the ads? Because we know that traditional ads have been created by people at the end of the day. They've been created at agencies, creatives, and so on. But when it's machines putting this out there, are we maybe going to be more forgiving because we don't expect the machine to hold the same standards? Yeah, I think it's really important to think about it. I don't know if you have further opinion on that.
Yeah, I just share your point of view, and I'd like to add some practical thoughts on that. We often say we are what we eat. That's the same for AI. Right? So AI system is a recommendation system based on what they learned from data. The system is based on this data. So that's not really simple question you're asking, but at the same time, I'm just thinking about the concern that, the question it's raising. Did we even think about the bias of the agency that was previously writing the ads? Did we think about it? Now we really think about the importance of this bias just because it's a machine that is doing it? I think that's a good point. Now we have to think about it, and the good news is that we are asking those questions, but that was already the case, right? So that's interesting because we feel more free to ask the question because this is just a system. We are not giving a judgment or, you know, trying to say, hey, this agency made a biased recommendation.
Although now I think if you advertise, you kind of pay attention to the perception of biases.
Very much so, yeah. I would agree.
So at some point, I think if we want to look what's further, what's going on. So bias is a big topic for AI, is a really big topic for AI. And ethics is what means to give some solutions to these problems, right? But at some point, we are talking about consumers, and we want to try to make them consume. They are consumers, so they consume. If they are human, they are human. But we are talking about consumers, so at some point, we really want to try to make them take a decision. So we have to put some bias to make them take a decision, right? Just the right bias that will make them buy our product. If we are honest about that, we have to use the technology on a right way and be aware as a consumer that it does exist, right?
I have a question.
Yeah. So many questions there. Yeah.
Xavier, I just want to re-ask you the same question that, from your experience, I mean, what do you think about, because you were talking about when you have a humanoid robots, humans are expecting human behaviors. And the question was, what are the limits of the robots that you want to create, or you think you're going to create, to limit the non-expected behaviors from human? I mean, where are the limits of what a human wants, how the robot behaves, and which are the limits where they want the robot to choose your own life?
I see. Your question is, where do we want to put a limit between what makes us human and what do we want this robot to be? Something like that?
Something like that.
Right. Yeah. My point is that we are humans. They are things.
Yeah.
And funny part, Margarita, you introduced Koibot as a person, right? That's exactly the kind of expectation we have to manage. This is not a person. Sorry about that. And I really don't want it to become a person with an autonomous decision-making process and so on. I just want it to be a tool to be as easy to use as possible, right? As instinctive and intuitive to use as possible. And I want all the users to be aware that this kind of machine might make their life really simpler, and at the same time, they might be a good tool to convey a lot of different messages that they just have to take care of what makes sense for them and what doesn't make sense for them. You know, their own self. They have to think about their own self. You know, that's really what motivates me in this job, this long journey that you know for a long time now. It's what does it really means to be a human in front of these machines. And as a mirror, you know, the same mirrors of Anna, they are the kind of mirrors I'm using to ask those questions about myself. And the limit you're talking about is how does people understand that it's just a machine and they are the humans, right? And we really want to build systems that is explainable, really explainable, that people understand that it's just a machine. You know, sometimes we put some behaviors where the machine just say, "I'm just a machine," just to put the frontier, right? And I think it's really important.
I have a question to Anna and about your research. and you mentioned that I have two questions. The first question is about the product category you choose in your study, because you choose makeup. So it's very related to self-esteem, right?
Yeah.
So do you think this product category influential result? For example, if I want to buy a costume in Halloween, so I may not want this costume to make me feel good about myself. I may want it to feel scary, right? And so I think maybe the result. I'm not sure. This is the question I asked. Do you think the product category influential result? The second question is about an idea after I listened to your presentation, because you test the relationship between the AR and purchase intention, right?
Mm-hmm.
But did you do something about customer engagement, so post-purchase behaviors? Because the company, in order to motivate the customer to buy more, they may make the AR very advanced, so that the customer may look better than the moment when they use the real products. So maybe after they use the product, they may feel disappointed because the product is not as good as they show. So do you think it may influence this study as well? Or what's your answer to this question?
Yeah. Thank you for the two questions. So in terms of the effect of the product category, so we really made so much of an effort to measure all the possible variables that could covariate. So we measured makeup characteristics, makeup expertise, different types of self-esteem, also the general self-esteem, and then the self-esteem appearance, how much they engage in variety seeking in terms of makeup and so on. And when we included these covariates, the results remained significant. Yeah, I totally appreciate the comment that the studies were done in the beauty sector, and they were also, I have to say, that all the participants were female, and self-esteem with female we know works slightly differently as opposed to male. But the important result for us, I guess, had to do with this, with the gap, because we know that the ideal actual gap is an important driver in the behavior. So even we had the control groups, right? We had the regular mirror and the normal mirror, and in the regular mirror there was no makeup really happening at all. So it was just their image and how they see themselves in the mirror, as opposed to the one where they saw the makeup. And then later on we controlled for these different types of how makeup is overlaid. I think these results are stable and telling for this category, and I would imagine they would be probably to a large extent replicated if you ran a similar study with the body augmentation, so clothes and so on, because a lot of the findings relate to studies on beauty standards and in retail context that Argo and Dahl have been conducting and publishing in JCR. What I cannot assume at this stage is how this kind of augmented self would be reacted to when you talk about different type of augmentation. So if you talk about skill augmentation, if you talk about cognition augmentation, there I would not, I would not dare to say, yeah, I think we could expect these results being replicated.